Mexico, Albany, California, Waterford, Virginia. Excellent. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, Wendy from Albany, California, who I know. Good to
We get
see you
started
here.
exactly at the top of the hour, and because I'm deficient on
It is
time,
8. It is the top
eight
of the hour.
o'clock. All right, welcome everybody. Hi, Rona. Nice to have you here. She's from Lexington. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. As you join us and as your friends join us, go ahead and say hi, because this is not about having a presentation, as I mentioned. This is just here for everybody to know why we're here. And we're here today to talk about having a conversation about talking across differences. Now, this is a little different from things that we've hosted, at least.
You
Can
froze.
you?
Uh-oh.
She
Uh-oh.
froze.
Oh, no.
Elise,
Ah,
Oh, there she's
there
back.
she is. No,
Nope.
she's.
Of course, you only freeze at the top of the hour, right?
No.
That's Murphy's Law.
No. Yeah.
If we had her speaking points, we could dive in.
I was going to say we could each introduce ourselves. Oh, there. She's back.
okay, am I back?
Yes,
Oh, so frustrating.
I know.
Talking across differences and unstable internet connections, right? So, so I wanted to just give a little bit of background about why we're doing this, because at least we help teams run successful meetings. And of course, there are lots of times when in those meetings, we need to work across differences. So how can we meet successfully with people from other departments that never seem to get it? Or how do we manage a project with coworkers when they're in India and the US and Germany, and all of them seem to mean different things when they say yes or due date? You know, those are all crazy conversations. But we're hosting the conversation right now for another reason. Because as we head into the holidays, where many of us go back into our larger families and our communities, I think it's important to know how we talk successfully with those we hope to love, but in reality find very, very challenging to be around. And as our political and environmental world gets crazier every day, how can we get enough people working together on solutions that we need to help us and our children thrive in the future? So I believe that if we seek to increase diversity and inclusion and the range of perspectives engaged in the active pursuit of our collective goals, that it's incumbent upon us as leaders and mentors and peers to first and foremost include and engage. I mean, we have to not work just with those who share our ideas and values, but engage all of those most critically who do not. And finally, I think it's incredibly important that collectively we reestablish norms of nonviolence and a commitment to staying in integrity throughout hard discussions. Mm-hmm. We have to learn how to talk across our differences to find a common path, and we have to do it now. Which is why I am so grateful and so delighted that these wonderful experts have volunteered their time to talk with us about the ways they found to successfully talk across difference. And I care about this one. By way of introduction, I would love to have you each share who you are and just a little story about what is possible, because it is possible. Joe, can you please start?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I'm touched that you're so touched. I often think that this is one of the hardest topics for the clients I work with. You know, how do you have these difficult and crucial conversations that we need to have? So I'm Jo Ilfeld. I am an executive leadership coach in the Bay Area and consultant. My at Insight to Leadership, and I work with both individuals. I work with teams, talking across differences often, and I work with groups or do trainings as well. And it's funny. I was thinking about like all all the difficult conversations my clients have that they have in the future. I'm doing a team offsite Monday and Tuesday, so I'm thinking about that as well. But I often think about how hard these conversations are to have. And one of my clients, this is a few years ago now, she called me up. A new org chart had come out. I don't know. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, when there's sort of a shifting and a realignment, and suddenly there's a new org chart. And her org chart came out, and everyone who was not expected to be there over 18 months was in red. And her name was in red, and she had no plans to leave.
Wow.
So she calls me up, and she's just like, oh my God, I want to talk to HR. I don't know what to do. And of course her boss is on vacation, like 2 weeks abroad, like don't bother me, that kind of thing. So she can't even, talk to her boss. So she's trying to figure out how to have this conversation with HR, and we're sort of mapping it out. And what comes out underneath it is, I don't want to find out they don't want me anymore. So it's like, oftentimes we want to have these conversations, and yet we're really afraid what's on the other side of them. Like, what if we put our ideas forward, in a strategic planning, and we learn that everyone thinks that's wrong, and that, we don't have the right approach. So there's all this fear about having these conversations and finding out things that we don't want to find out. The good news is she did finally have the conversation, and her boss, who was leaving, everyone knew they were in a search for the role, that they had just put some key people underneath him in red too, because they were just not sure where they would shift out after 18 months, with him gone. And 3 years later, she is still there. So that's the good news. But I think we can all relate to needing to have a conversation, and both wanting and not wanting to do it at the same time. And I think that's what makes these conversations even harder to engage in, is that we're not always fully sure we want to.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Settle Murphy. I'm in a suburb of Boston, and I primarily work with distributed teams, so geographically distributed teams, most of which cross time zones and national cultures. So my real specialty, and what I spend much of my time doing, is either training or coaching leaders or distributed team members in how to communicate more successfully, or I actually design the meetings and facilitate them. So there's so many opportunities for miscommunications and making uncharitable assumptions when you have very little opportunities for real-time conversations of any kind, and when you have cultural differences and oftentimes language differences. So one example I thought of, I was going to be facilitating a retreat for a CIO of a very large software company in Massachusetts. And part of my prep work was to interview some of the American managers. All the senior managers were here in Mass, and also several of the managers in India. And what I found through my interviews is that the Americans felt like the Indian team didn't really understand their work, didn't have strategic thinking, so they started just delegating them all the menial stuff. And they started taking back all the strategic work back to Massachusetts. Now, when I interviewed the Indian managers, they felt completely disrespected by the American managers, who they felt the American managers clearly don't know what they're doing because they're not giving us any directions. They're just giving us this kind of big picture stuff and telling us to figure it out. And so both managers in both locations were very distrustful of each other. There was a lot of antagonism. And when they came together in a conference room at our retreat, the air was pretty thick. And I showed some slides from one of my favorite books called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, which shows on a continuum how different cultures compare along different critical dimensions of teamwork. And I got to the one on trust. And it was there was silence and then laughter, because what they saw was Americans are as far over as you can imagine on the scale when it comes to, I assign trust by, do you fulfill your commitment? Do you do it quickly? Do you do it efficiently? That's what I care about. If yes, I can trust you. On the total opposite end were Indian people from the Indian culture, and they assign trust based on, do we take the time to know each other? Have we developed a relationship? Do you respect me? Do you know me? So when everyone in the room saw that, they just said, we get it. We get it. We know what we need to do now. So that was a huge light bulb moment. And that's an example of, I think, people not wanting to have the difficult conversation and not able to very easily because they're 10 and a half hours apart time-wise. But also it's an icky conversation. It's a difficult conversation. So that was an example of conversations that they both wanted to have separately, and then they finally had it together in a room by establishing some common ground.
Awesome. That would have been a fascinating room to be in.
It was.
Jen.
Hi, my name is Jen, and I'm founder of Civic Dinners, which is all about bringing people together around a dinner table for conversations that matter. And we had been doing some work in the back in 2015 as a pilot with the Atlanta Regional Commission, honestly at a time when it was hard to get people around a common and a shared vision for what they wanted. We had just failed to pass a major transportation referendum. We had the cheating scandals of our public school systems on national news, and then snowpocalypse happened. Like an inch of snow just drowned our entire city stuff. And I think we were desperate for like a coming together moment to get across our differences around policy. And I found that, I think back to Nancy's point and to Joe's point, like when it comes to trust, like one of the, we've discovered is like the fastest way to build trust is by showing vulnerability first and by being open. And so when we brought together millennials and civic leaders across the entire region, we open it up with the opportunity to share what are you most proud of about the Atlanta region, and what are you most embarrassed about the region. And that opportunity to shine both light and darkness, to be able to be a critic of yourself and of your own leadership, and that like helped really open and crack the conversation in a way that's like, we acknowledge that we're not perfect and we know there's work to be done, but there's still moments to celebrate and things that we want to work on as a whole. So also, but keeping it future focused, knowing that what may have slowed us down or caused that pain in the past, we can overcome that by working, trying to figure out that tension between what we want and what we have now. And that's what motivates action. So I think our philosophy and thinking around, especially given the times that we're in, and at least you mentioned this, like given the political environment and the toxicity of our tribal mindsets, when it's like us versus them, and our tendency to want to be part of the team and have that loyalty there, we have to be willing to open up and say, like, yes, we have to be willing to like poke holes in our own team sometime and acknowledge that, you know what, we don't have and maybe we can learn from others and not be so dead set on our own ways. And I think that is more important than ever before. And we need to be willing to be vulnerable and share like where we think we can move forward. And there's a very specific example of this is we have a conversation called Common Ground, which is about bringing together people from different political perspectives. So whether it's the Democratic side or the Republican side, and we designed it with actual strategists from both sides, the full spectrum of strategists at the table. And what we came to was we really have to understand how you came to this perspective. What are the, it's like we're all influenced by outside forces. We don't just pop out into this world and start believing one way or another. We have our own life experiences that really shape our beliefs and our point of views. And then we're also influenced by the media, by what we read, by who we work with, by who we live with. And those influences can can change our perspectives on issues. And so just acknowledging that, like, when have you experienced a moment where you changed your mind on something? Or when did a new piece of information change your perspective or make you think about something differently? So kind of being able to bridge those differences starts with the willingness to also know that not everything is concrete and figured out. It's not black and white. It's very gray or colorful, lots of different perspectives. So for us, it's all, to kind of summarize it, it's about being vulnerable, being willing and able to know that maybe it's possible that there's another better way, that there's a better way that we can work together, that we can collaborate together, that we can create a vision and move forward. And practicing that, and by starting to be vulnerable first, being the brave one to go first.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're frozen.
Okay, great. I bet I freeze in incredibly vulnerable looking faces, don't I?
No, you look perfectly calm and composed.
Excellent. So that's our group today. And as we go through the conversation for the rest of the hour, I have some questions prepared to ask each of them. And then if you have questions or comments on what you're hearing, you want to add into the conversation. We can't have everybody on video, but we absolutely can all chat in the chat to reflect on and add and chime in our own challenges and our own successes in this area, because this is a really complex and challenging topic. So we'll definitely bring that into the conversation if you can offer it for us in the chat or in the question box. And then the other thing that we're doing, the conversation is recorded. And as we go through, I'm capturing things that are resources that people mention that we can put into the email afterwards. So Nancy mentioned the Culture Map book, so that'll be in there. And then Jen started talking about how we each form our own understanding of truth. And my favorite simple book that explains that is Liminal Thinking by Dave Gray. So resources like that will be in the follow-up. And with that, let's get into a few more questions. So the first question is actually for Jen again. And Jen, if you can speak up just a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yes, for sure.
So we've had some stories and some ideas of what's possible. Now let's get really kind of practical as we can. When you are heading into what might be a really challenging conversation, which is the entirety of your business, right? Is hosting and planning challenging conversations. What is it important for you as a leader or even a participant to do to prepare yourself? Yeah. And how can you set that environment, set the frame for success?
Thank you. So with Civic Dinners, our whole model is based on bringing people together around these difficult conversations. And honestly, I feel like the best way to ease into that is obviously by putting food in front of people. By actually creating an environment that is safe and comfortable for people, especially if they know that it might be a controversial topic or an interesting or just an in-depth. Food automatically just puts people at ease, and there's actually science to back it up that we as humans are wired to bond with people when we break bread together. And even if it's a coffee or it's some kind of communal practice, especially in Eastern cultures where exactly that, they want to get to know you. If you host it in a more kind of meaningful environment that's cozy and warm and welcoming, you already set the tone of that this is about deeper understanding and not a high sterile environment that's about right versus wrong. So I think setting the tone in the environment is critical, and if it's possible, food always helps because people tend to just let loose a little bit more once they know that there's kind of food and community. Food is love in a lot of unspoken languages. So I think setting the tone is critical. Then I think starting back to the impetus of better conversations. So Civic Dinners is all about having better conversations by starting with the story of self. so often, I mean, you mentioned Brene Brown before when we were speaking, like I absorb everything that she's talking about. And one thing in particular is like this vulnerability, the willingness to start with a story of self. And we've also learned from the King Center and the Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence that the best way to communicate, especially coming from a perspective of sharing your perspective and understanding, is that you have to use I statements. You never want to start a conversation with you this, you did this, do this, as far as blaming goes, and then because the other person immediately goes on defense. So the first thing that I always recommend doing is starting, and that's why our first question is typically around kind of introduce yourself, and it's asking a question that makes them think introspectively about a time in their past and a moment in the experience or how they might be feeling about something at that time. And with similar to the Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence, the nonviolent communication method always starts with, you know what, I feel this when this happens, basically. So you're just responding, you're sharing the impact of how this, why this issue matters to you and how it impacts you personally. Because nobody can argue with that. And you're not putting blame on another person, but you're allowing your true authentic self to express how you feel about something and how it's impacting you, and then you have the opportunity to, if the other person wants to repeat back to you, that's just a common practice again within nonviolent communication, is for them to kind of make sure that they were listening. And so that you said, would you mind, I mean, does that make sense? Do you mind, I mean, if you want to repeat back to me what you said, and then once they fully understand, then you can make a request. And so the same thing, our flow and conversation structure always starts with the story of self to really understand the perspective of how people feel about a certain issue, either because maybe it's the first time they understood race, and that's a really hard conversation for people, but if they can put it in their perspective of their own life experience and their own interpretation, and then listen to everybody else's story of self, how they came to understand race, then you've got a common, everybody's in the same energy field here. And then now you can start to elevate what are our shared challenges and struggles, and what are we recognizing today that's present that we don't feel is right. And that opens the opportunity to kind of put all the cards on the table, is to evaluate and effectively kind of really dig into the harder topics. Then the final thing, the key component, is to be able to wrap up the conversation with essentially a story of now. Like what can we do to move this conversation forward? What action am I willing to take? What can we do together? And it's really important not to say, you should do this. You should. The should just be wiped from our vocabulary, because it immediately implies blame and implicit assumptions about their willingness and skills and commitment. So it's important to get a sense of commitment of how you want to move forward from that conversation, however, whatever action that might be. So I think the key themes to think of, a couple kind of other ground rules that we always set, is just to assume the positive in others. So often we tell our own stories, we make up our own narratives in our head of because they didn't respond to our email, what they might be thinking. But we have no idea what is really going on within the other person's mind until we allow them to share. And so I think assuming positive intent until shown otherwise is the best way to approach that. And also always keep in mind the final key theme is like, keep in mind the positive outcome that you want, and put that out forward. Like celebrate what you want to accomplish together and why you're here, and how cool it is that we live in a country where we can have opposing perspectives and viewpoints and share them. And it's okay to disagree sometimes. So those are kinds of the things that I keep in mind when approaching a difficult conversation. Just first being vulnerable, being open to sharing my perspective and how I feel and how this impacts my life, and how, and then going from there, understanding the other perspective, allowing them the chance to air their voice and their perspective, and then being able to really talk about some of those higher level shared challenges, and then saying, well, here's what I commit to do now, moving forward.
Nice. Nice. I heard a lot of things in there that are foundational best practices in meetings as well, and that we're seeing in the business world, where the not always food.
Yeah.
Although I'm a huge fan of food. One of my most popular Inc. articles is like food you should have in your meetings. But the research backing on the business meeting front talks about hosting.
Yeah.
You know, how do you create stewardship and hosting in that welcome? And then how do you, I heard ground rules in there. So setting an expectation of assuming positive intent. So graciousness in your perspective. And I heard the coming in with the right mindset, but I also heard establishing clarity of purpose up front so that you could get to those outcomes at the end. Joe, Nancy, are there things in the setting that frame that you feel should also be in people's toolkit or mindset right now?
Well, first of all, I want to say I love Kate's comment about assuming most positive, most respectful interpretation. I think I might steal that, Kate.
That's beautiful.
I really like that. Let's see, building on, I think you, Jen, said a lot. I would add that importance of establishing, as you said, the common goals. And I always also like to try to get people in a, let's say, in a positive mindset by creating, maybe an early question is something like your idealized future state when it comes to X. So people get energized and feel like, yeah, this is something they all want in a really visceral way. So that's just one addition. And then in talking about food, when I facilitate face-to-face, which is maybe half the time it's virtual, half the time it's face-to-face, I bring candy of several varieties. Last time, though, I brought candy with a lot of nuts, so I make sure I don't, because it was a nut building. And tabletop toys, like things for people to fidget with. For two reasons. One is I think a lot of people think better, and it can be a stress release, but also so many people are addicted to this.
Yeah.
And I've literally seen people not knowing what to do with their fingers when they're not allowed to use their devices, or we all agree everyone's present and that means no devices. So by giving them something to hold that isn't noisy, really seems to help. And it adds a little bit sense of fun or whimsy, and people can choose to use them or not.
Can I share something really fun? I use pipe cleaners because you can do anything with them. You can just stroke them. And at my last workshop, one of the guys made me this.
Oh, that's great.
So
that is great.
He's like, I know you like masks. So he made me a mask.
That's awesome.
And he learned some things. It was an awesome workshop, but
we've actually used
a great
thinking
tip.
putty in our team workshops, and the thinking putty is also very tactile and great, but I totally agree with Nancy about giving people something. Sometimes just if they're frustrated, it's just like something to play with so it doesn't come out in other ways. Also in terms of agreements I think are important is that we often talk, we often will use the agreement step forward, then step back. And I think it's really important to, for people to, or active participation, you want everyone to speak, but then you don't want people to sort of hold forth. Some people have very strong views and they want to share them for a long time. And, we've all been in meetings that have been hijacked by these views. So I think it's just as important to make sure that that everyone is participating, or, whatever it means to not take up too much airtime, or to notice. I know Google uses a meeting tracker, like who's talking, in the room, to make sure everyone's sort of getting equal airtime. But I think that's especially important when you have things like strategic planning and everyone has different perspectives and information, and you want to make sure they all get in the room, whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert.
Joe, that's such a good point, and I forgot to mention that that's the entire structure of the Civic Dinner. Typically, it's a host with 6 to 10 guests, 3 big questions. But what makes it such a whole conversation is that it's equal time to share with one voice at a time. So typically people have about 2 to 3 minutes to answer and share their story. And that makes it feel immediately disarms people that nobody's the expert, not even the host, and that you don't have to have a special speaker or even a topic, but it's a true conversation. And by using the power of storytelling to do the hard work of building empathy and trust and demonstrating vulnerability, that's what creates the magic, and that like, creates that unity and sense of family, honestly.
Yeah. Elise, I'll say one more thing about Jen's story, which I think is great, and probably all of us do it. But I think, however you sort of create some openness in the room, people do icebreakers, they do stories, they do something. But I think it is so key to have people, to land people in the room, like with something that really engages them and really understanding who else is in the room with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got to connect, because you can't work together until you're all together. Right. And Gail is looking for positive ways to get back on track when someone's hijacking the conversation. I think that's a good opportunity to segue to our next question, which is related. So Nancy, I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about when you're in one of these conversations and you think you've communicated clearly, and perhaps you've set a ground rule, for example, about sharing airtime, or you think you've got an agreement on dates or whatever it is, and then you see people reacting in ways, well, to be charitable and to have our most respectful interpretation, let's just say that the ways that they're reacting don't make sense to you. What should you do?
So one of the first things I do, and keep in mind, a lot of my meetings are virtual, so sometimes it's harder to detect dysfunctional behavior when you're remote. I've
just
become pretty well attuned to it, though. So the first thing I would do is, and this is a tough one because we have a choice as facilitators. One choice is to single someone out. So let's say, Elise, we're in the middle of brainstorming, and I've asked everyone, we've set some brainstorming guidelines, no editing, it's quantity, not quality at first, etc. And you, Elise, you trample on everyone's idea. You make faces, you jump in, you say why it won't work, and this goes on for several minutes. And as a result, everyone else is shutting down and looking at me with panic in their eyes, like, do something. So I have a choice. I can either address the whole group and say something like, well, a few minutes ago, just to remind you, we had agreed to ground rules that are maybe unique for brainstorming in a way that we had agreed that we would do X, Y, and Z. And so I just want to remind everyone, because what I've noticed is that the energy is ebbing, and I'd like to get back. I'd like to hear all voices. We talked about the importance of that, et cetera, et cetera. So let me ask the question in a different way, and then I'd ask some stimulating question to get more ideas to come. So that's one choice. The other choice is, if you, Elise, I'll pick on you again, are being completely disrespectful to everyone, and this has gone on and on and on, I may need to say something like, and I call it a 3-step intervention model, something like, first step is neutrally describe what I am observing. So rather than saying you're being negative, you're trampling, it's just, I've noticed the last 5 times people have started to give a response, you have interrupted them. Pause. So I think silence is really powerful, both virtually and face-to-face. Step 2, the implications of this behavior. And as a result, I'm noticing that others have started to shut down and pull away. And I'm concerned that we have 10 minutes left for this brainstorming portion. And I'm concerned that we don't have the sufficient ideas by which we'll winnow down the list next time we talk, something like that. So what I'm observing, the implications. Third step is my ask. So what I would ask you to do, and this could be for everyone or just Elise, but I'd ask you to do is for the next few minutes, if we still agree with these ground rules, let's get some more ideas flowing. I have a few more questions. And then when it comes to winnowing down the list using agreed upon criteria, let's say that's our next conversation, then let's talk about what are the conditions for success for each of these ideas. So that's my general approach is that those 3 steps. What I think is toughest for anyone, including for me, and I'm a seasoned facilitator, is to know what is the intervention I need to make. In this case, I must, because I feel my obligation is for the safety of this group, to have a safe, productive conversation. I will not let one person ruin that for everyone else. So I have an obligation to the group. I'm really clear about that. It's the extent to which I call that one person versus speak more generally to the group. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think there's situations where one is called for and not. It depends on so many factors, but that's generally what I do. And also if I'm face-to-face, I post the ground rules that we've all agreed to. So after we go over the meeting goals, I will say, so what kind of behaviors or attitudes do we all need to exhibit here today to reach these shared goals? What kind of behaviors? And I let people tell me, and then they own them, rather than me saying, here are the ground rules I'd like you to live by. Then good luck with that.
Awesome. I think something you've said there highlights something that many people may not have in their toolkit, which is the importance of having those expectations, those common expectations for how you'll be together in dialogue established in the first place. And when we come in and work in workshops or in facilitations or dinners, that's one of the activities we'll do, is establish those there. And we get the special privilege of doing that because we're, the weird expert who's come in from on high to make this special occasion happen. For those of you who work in standing teams and you don't have something like that in place, there are a number of techniques to look at about creating those agreements together. And one of the questions we get asked often is, okay, we've got these team agreements. We've worked through how we're going to meet or how we're going to communicate, and then nobody looks at them. What do I do with them? Well, that's the example, right? You invoke them. You create some agreements, and then you live them by asking for the group or for the individual to come into play there. That is a hard situation. So in the case of somebody who's hijacking, would you use one of those interventions, or would you,
Well, I would. Well, if you were there's the hijacker that people don't like, and then there's the affable hijacker that people find charming and really don't mind. So that's a tougher one to me. What I often do with the dominant person is so Elise, I'm going to pick on you again. If you're talking, first of all, I apologize for interrupting. And in the virtual world, I can't shoot you dagger eyes. I can't kick you under the table. I can't sidle up to you and use my body language. So I only have my voice. So I'll apologize. Elise, sorry for interrupting. You have some really valuable perspectives. And I want to work with you perhaps after this meeting to think about other ways that maybe you can post some information, or we can include that in the agenda for next time, etc. For now, however, I just want to make sure I understand the key point. So I'd like to summarize the key point. So, because I want you to feel valued, I want you to feel listened to, and I want you to let go of the mic, the proverbial mic. So then I will quickly summarize what I thought your key point. I don't usually say, is that right? Because then you got the mic again. But I will summarize, and then if I feel like, and capture it in the parking lot if appropriate. And then at the end of the meeting, always go back to that parking lot so it's not perceived as a black hole that's fake. Then I might ask you, so what are some ways that you can convey some of that valuable knowledge, maybe outside of meeting time, etc. So that's how I usually approach a dominant speaker.
if I can add something, so Gail had asked a question about positive ways to get the conversation back on track when someone hijacks it, and Nancy's points are amazing. And I know a lot of you, if you're in the meeting and not a facilitator, you feel like I don't have this kind of power that Nancy has, as facilitator. But I think you can take a lot of the great things she's saying and sort of use them even if you're in the meeting. So you can sort of interrupt someone, say like, oh, Bob, those are some great points. I hear you saying X, Y, and Z. And then you can almost hand the mic to someone else and say, Susie, would you, Susie, are you seeing what Bob's seeing, or do you see it a little differently? Like, and, you might give it to someone who's an introvert in the meeting to give them, to change the focus. So you can, even if you're not a, gifted facilitator like Nancy, you can still take her techniques and use some. Another thing that you can often do too is you can say something like, wow, I feel like there's a lot of stuff in the room. Can we all take just a pause and like a step back, and then just everyone go around the room and say like, what do they think is the most important thing so far? What do they think we need to talk about next or something, and do a go round, because I feel like go rounds are a great way to break up from someone who has hijacked.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool.
We have gratitude rounds where if it gets really heated, where there's two people going at it, we just pause, acknowledge the energy and passion in the room, and celebrate that to some extent. But then we all just want to take a moment and have everybody go around one by one and just say something that they're really grateful for in this moment right now. And that really helps bring everything back down to a very appreciative moment, and we can start again.
Those are beautiful. I love the pause plus the round. And Trina in chat says she uses garden instead of parking lot.
I love that.
I love that too.
I might steal
parking
that.
lot is troublesome. Yeah, I think we've got a lot of excellent borrows in this particular call. I also am delighted by the term affable hijacker. So these are excellent. So if you have more questions, please go ahead and comment, add them in the chat. In terms of passing the proverbial mic, our next question actually is for Joe. And Joe, we've touched on some of this before, but I wonder if you can dig a little deeper into how, when we're in these challenging conversations, when we personally hear things that feel like they're attacking something that we believe in passionately, or maybe they're even attacking us personally. And oftentimes our beliefs and our values and our identity are all wrapped in a tight little knotted ball that, that is important for us to protect. So when that happens, how can we stay in those conversations while also staying in integrity with our values?
Elise, I feel like you've been at my Thanksgiving dinners, but
I may have personal motivation for asking these questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny, I was just talking about this exact thing with a client yesterday who was, bringing to me like someone had, brought something to her, and, she got very defensive, right? And went into more of a defensive posture and like defending her values and her turf and, the workplace and her team, right? And often someone will come up to us and we do feel that need to defend. So there's 3 things I really recommend highly to people in this situation. The first one is both the easiest and the hardest one. The easiest one to physically do and the hardest one to actually do in the moment. But how do you take a breath? Like, whether it's a pause, I even tell people, like, if you're like really flummoxed by something, like if you're at a Thanksgiving table, let's say, or a meeting, drop a pen, drop a fork, and go to pick it up and like take a deep breath while you're picking it up. Like there's no rule that you have to respond within 2 seconds, to something someone else says. And what we know about the nervous system too is that when we get agitated, our cortisol hypes up, and that's our sympathetic nervous system. And when we take a breath where the exhale is longer than the inhale, so, you might think of blowing through a straw, or, You know, sometimes I say like smelling the, or, you know, if you're Thanksgiving, smell the soup, cool the soup. You know, that's how we teach kids about long breaths. But those kind of breaths where the exhale is longer, that actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest. So you'll digest your Thanksgiving meal better, and you'll sort of, and you tell your body, okay, this is not a life or death situation. I can, you know, I can come at this with more calmness and more thoughtfulness. So that's the first step. And I think when we hear things that are triggering, we want to respond so quickly. But like really, the more we can train ourselves to put that pause in, take that breath, our response is going to be both more more us, you know, how we want to be in the world, you know, our better selves, and it will also probably be more lucid, to be honest, lucid meetings, you know, if we have that pause. So that's the first thing, is taking that pause. The second thing is really having curiosity. And I think that a lot of times, like I was talking about with my client yesterday, if you ask questions, that doesn't mean you're agreeing with someone. You know, just because you're not immediately going to defense doesn't mean that you're taking everything they say as like accepting, but like ask curiosity, like, well, why are you saying that about my team? Like, walk me through what you're seeing. You know, walk me through how you're seeing this. Walk me through why this is the best strategy for 2020, you know, and you're getting more data, because a lot of times, first of all, even in the crazy, there's often a lot of good data and a lot of good points of view that are important to see. And secondly, when we come from a more defensive place, often we might be answering like the very top level of what they're saying, but we're not getting at the underneath of what they're really bringing to us. So they're really bringing, you know, something about their values, right? As Jen has mentioned, you know, everyone has a background, everyone has a context. And by adding curiosity to the conversation, you're understanding more of their context, more of their background, how they're seeing things, and you're going to be able to give a more complete answer that, you know, really meets them where they are, or really meets the situation at work with what's really going on. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is perfect for a Thanksgiving table. And, you know, with credit to Wendy Palmer, who I completely stole it from, but she talks about how oftentimes when we hear things, especially if it feels like it's criticism or someone attacking our views, like, you know, how can you believe that? Do you believe all kids should, you know, whatever, you know, people take things to these extremes. And then it feels like it's coming right at us, like they are attacking us. It's coming right at us. It's pointed at us. And what Wendy Palmer talks about is, how can you let it fall on the table between you? So that then what happens is, if you can almost picture the words falling on the table instead of on you, then you can have some objectivity to it. You know, you can sort of look at it. You can say like, that's interesting that you think that, you know, we're like, you know, like, that's funny. And it doesn't have to mean as much about you or attack your values. Like they're making their offering, you know, to the Thanksgiving table or the work table or the meeting room. And you can choose what you decide to accept or engage in or not. But it gives you some space and some objectivity around it, rather than feeling like it's coming at you.
I love those.
Wow. Amen, Joe. All big points.
I love that. Sip the soup, blow the soup. I'm just going to completely teach every single one of my children to blow their soup. We teach them instead to say things like, oh, I hear ya. And I'm like, you know, let people be heard. You don't have to actually agree with them.
Yeah, exactly. My daughter,
tell me more.
Speaking of another breath that people often teach is a 4-7-8 breath, where you inhale for 4, hold for 7, and exhale for 8. And I've taught my daughter this in times of really high stress, like when we were doing a ropes course together, and she was freaking out. It was really good. And anyway, I went to her back to school night, and her teacher had 4-7-8 breaths on the thing, and said, every class I start with the 3-4-7-8 breaths. And I'm thinking, that's great for the kids. She goes, I don't know if it helps the kids, but it's awesome for me.
So Nancy, Jen, do you have other little tips like that you use with folks?
Wow. I mean, I feel like Joe summarized it so beautifully and eloquently, and all of the key points as far, I love especially your last point around letting comments and feedback fall on the table in between in the space so that you're not reactive, but you can observe and acknowledge. I think that's such a critical part of just nonviolent communication in general, is this sense of being able to observe and respond without emotion. I think where things go wrong in conversations that go wrong is that people take it personally, and then they feel threatened, and then they respond in kind with a personal jab, and that can be an end to a relationship just like that. So I feel by keeping it respectful and observing and being able to respond, even if it means you need to take a breath after that and just let it sit and let it sink in, and then I think asking for more clarity, or can you tell me more? And kind of recognizing and being able to dive a little bit deeper to unpack the complexities or their perspective. I think the curiosity point is right on as well, and that is all we are all about. That it's all about asking questions that get to the heart of the issue and the personal perspective. So kudos, love it.
And one thing I just want to add about the curiosity, I think a really important thing to try to discern from each other is what are our assumptions. So I might have a hotly contested view that A, B, and C is true, and someone might say, but X, Y, and Z. Well, let's stop a minute and unpack our assumptions. So is that, and to find out, is that data? Is it based on data? Is it based on feelings? And what are your assumptions? And I find that when we talk about our different assumptions, we often end up agreeing with each other because we were making assumptions that we either erroneous or otherwise misunderstood. So I think it's getting to our assumptions is a really important part of that conversation.
Yeah.
So, oh, hi, friend. So
that's my son.
So speaking of getting into conversation, we have just a little bit of time left, and we're going to do a final round in our last couple minutes. But there are two questions that are very related that have come up from our audience. So all of the tips that we were just talking about assume that you're actually in a conversation. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges is oftentimes there are differences going on, and you're working with somebody who won't engage, who is conflict averse, or perhaps you've got a cultural difference where in one culture they don't speak up because they don't question. It's culturally inappropriate to question authority unless you have all of your ducks in a row. Nancy, I think this may be, especially on the cultural side, one that's really great for you. And then I would love to see if we have just really quick advice from the others.
Well, I'd say if it's a cultural difference, in national cultural differences, and there's certainly that culture map book I referenced has a big piece on conflict and disagreement. I think that it's important to let's say if you're in a group of people from a team with multiple cultures or conversation, I think of questions in advance that are more tuned to the positive. So rather than saying which idea do you like the best, I'd say something like, what are the conditions for success for this scenario to work exactly as planned? What do we have to do right? So I try to think of questions that don't force people into having negative answers or anything perceived as whining, but more just to try to elevate our thinking and not put anyone on the spot who doesn't want conflict. The other thing I do if we're looking for consensus, and that's a whole other story because that's a very difficult thing to do, especially virtually, is if everyone has a card or let's say a number 1 through 8, where 1 has a particular meaning, 8 has a particular meaning, and everything in between, on the count of 3, everyone hold up your card. Mm-hmm. So that can create a level playing field, so that if I'm from a culture that really values hierarchy, I will feel safe in giving my view because it's at the same time as everyone else. So I try to create a level playing field in many different ways, because you can't have the conversations off to the side with those people each time. Right. The conversations that have to take place with everyone.
Any other real super quick?
So I, not on the culture part, but on the conflict averse part, what I have often found, and I recommend to clients, is if you have someone that you know has a harder time with conflict or is more introverted too, what I often say is book a time with them, but give them a heads up, like in advance. So like, hey, I want to book a time and I want to talk about X, Y, and Z, so that they can sort of prepare, they can formulate their thoughts, and you can make sure that you are coming in as calm. You take as many deep breaths as you need to do before you get in there. But like, that you can't amp it up because then this person will retreat. But if you can have, set aside a conversation where you're both prepared to just talk about that thing, that can be really effective.
Awesome.
And saying, so I see one of the comments is saying that someone who is conflict averse and tends to shut down rather than speak up, I feel it's helpful to sometimes even pause the conversation there and say, like, if we need to pick this up and want to think on this and have another conversation offline. Like if someone say, I know this is really important to you and I want to make sure that you have some time to really think about it. That doesn't have to be so instantaneous. And sometimes just people, some people are super people pleasing and they want to say something even though they may not mean it. So we want to make sure that we give them the opportunity to really think through it and allow that privilege of time and space to help them be able to either gather the courage to really share or make their case or kind of just gather their thoughts more meaningfully.
Awesome. Thank you. I think those are all excellent, wonderful, incredibly useful tips. I'm going to write all of this up and hold it dear going into the next week. With your permission, I'd love to share some of these ideas that you've shared out, on Inc. and with some other folks. And as we go to attribute you and the work and the sources that all of you came from, quick final round, where can people find more about you and your work? And what is your number one thing you want us all to go out with at the end of this conversation? Joe, would you like to start?
Sure. So once again, I'm Jo Ilfeld, and my company is Insight to Leadership. That would be www.INCITOLEADERSHIP. Leadership. So it's Insight with a C, not an SIGHT.
Not an insight.
Yes, exactly.
Call to arms. Yeah.
It's a call to leadership. Thank you. And honestly, I think the best thing that people can leave here with is, something that both Jen and Nancy have really alluded to, is this idea of understanding the context of where things are coming from. And, first seek to understand before you're sort of seeking to disagree. And I think that is the key thing, especially around a Thanksgiving table, but also in strategic planning.
Thank you so much. Nancy?
So to reach me or to see my website, it's my company name is Guided Insights, GUIDEDINSIGHTS.com. I write a monthly newsletter. It's free. I don't use it for marketing, or you can search my web. And I just want to build on what Joe just said. I think one of the most important things that was really affirmed for me through this whole conversation is that whole idea of assuming good intentions, assuming that the other person has some integrity, has a reason for his or her beliefs, and really seek to get at those beliefs rather than, as Joe said, just seeking to spout my belief and try to win the fight.
Thank you. Jen?
And I'm Jen Graham, and my company is Civic Dinners. And so you can find us at civicdinners.com, plural, so CIVIC, and then DINNERS.com. And it would be amazing feel free to consider, if you want to practice some of this kind of in action, you can sign up for a dinner to attend or host on your own. And it's a great way to meet with
strangers who also care about the issues that you care about, and kind of practice this nonviolent communication and all of that. So, but I would say my thing is just remember that in the end, we are, everybody is somebody's child. And I think that to hold each other and embrace each other as other just humans, as we all have our own stories and our own upbringings. And at the end of the day, like, we're all trying to get by, and knowing that where we are in our journey is on our own. So I think, yeah, just echoing Joe and Nancy and Elise, that remembering that true respect comes from really listening and hearing people. And at the end of the day, people just want to feel heard and feel that they are valued. And so however you can approach a conversation with that intention in mind, making sure that they feel, when they leave that conversation, that they feel valued. That's what matters.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you
hope
to
all of
hosting
you,
this.
yeah, and I hope everybody here and everybody who watches the recording goes with respect and curiosity and a little bit more confidence into the challenging conversations ahead.
Yes.
Recording will come soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Denise.
Thanks.
Nice meeting everyone.
Thanks, you.
Nice meeting you
Bye.
guys.
And